Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, young adult librarian extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
Solitaire Frisbee from the Children's Room.
We're here talking more, having a conversation about Native American mythology.
Yes.
So I started kind of on the East Coast last time, and I'm moving progressively across country, although you really can't do that with myths, because so many myths are shared.
Right.
I want to bring us back to our old friend the trickster today,
Okay.
because tricksters are a popular part of like every mythology. Tricksters are often the most famous members of various like myth groups and so forth. And two of the most famous belong to Native American mythology, mostly from the West Coast. That is Coyote and Raven. Coyote from the Southwest and Raven from the Northwest. Mostly, because those animals both range across the entire country. So naturally, almost every tribe has some stories about these figures. And Raven and Coyote are two of the most famous Native American tricksters, and those stories often get intertwined. Sometimes one tribe will tell one story and say it was Coyote that did it, another tribe will say it was Raven that did it. So several of the stories you can find in almost virtually identical versions that are told of the different animals. And looking at it, I think the reason those two animals are linked is the things they have in common. Ravens and coyotes, you don't think automatically they have that much in common. They're both highly intelligent, which from a human point of view makes them tricksters, because they can ferret out food no matter where you've left it. You leave something lying around, you wrap it up and bury it in the ground. Yeah, coyote's going to find it, Raven's going to take off with it, something like that. So right away they're highly intelligent, they're very good at scavenging for food, and both of them will eat carrion. They are eaters of the dead. And in a spiritual sense, if you're an animal associated with the dead, that means you're kind of a middle ground between the world of the living and the world of the dead. They associate a lot of animals that had great spiritual power because they were associated with the dead, kind of like jackals in Egypt.
In any of these stories, do the Raven and Coyote appear together?
Not usually. Coyote has a lot of friends, some bird friends and some other mammal friends, but for the most part, they're separate.
Okay.
I've yet to find one that team up. However, contrary to the troubles I found finding really good African stories, coyote stories are everywhere.
Plentiful.
There are hundreds of coyote stories online. I couldn't even scratch the surface with the research that I did this week. So many of them out there. Some of them are really short, some of them are longer. There's several different versions of the same story. So Raven and Coyote are very famous. I've been a fan of Coyote for a long time. There was a comic book called Coyote that came out in the 70s or 80s, I think, done by Steve Englehart. And this was a guy who was a son of the god Coyote, trying to make his way in the world and not really understanding how the human world worked. He was sort of a quasi-superhero. Marvel Comics printed it, but he wasn't really a superhero. But so there's a lot of talk about Coyote stories in that one and the importance of Coyote. Coyote is so famous that sometimes people who are going to tell a story about a trickster will start by saying, this is a Coyote story. Even if Coyote doesn't actually appear, it's still a Coyote story if it's about a trickster. I have an anthology here, this is fiction, called Coyote Road. It's done by Ellen Datlow and Terry Windling, who are the current queens of like fantasy. They edit the best anthologies. And the cover is by Charles Best, one of my favorite artists. I have an entire book of his art in my section, which you've looked at. And there are modern day stories of tricksters, and in that they say, there's a very good introduction talking about the nature of tricksters, and they say that to walk the Coyote Road is to prepare yourself for things that are unexpected and life-changing. So Coyote is a rule breaker from day one. Show him a rule and he'll do the exact opposite. Coyote in many stories is responsible for creating the universe, and some of them he teaches people how to do certain things, teaches them powerful medicine. Coyote medicine is a powerful healing medicine, but with unpredictable side effects. Before I get started...
What kinds of unpredictable side effects?
I couldn't find any evidence of that. They say that coyote medicine is dangerous, but I couldn't find any evidence of exactly what it would do to you.
Okay.
It's definitely powerful, though. And the more powerful something is, the less likely you should mess with it. Now, it is very important that we're telling these stories here in wintertime, because that makes us safer. If you're telling a coyote story and it's like spring or summer, he'll probably hear you and come wandering by to listen to stories about himself because he has a huge ego like all tricksters. In the wintertime, he's probably hibernating now. As in many of these Native American stories, these are both gods, and they have all the attributes of a human being, and they have the attributes of the animal namesake. So he's both a coyote and the coyote, and has the same trials and tribulations that ordinary people do.
Interesting.
Yeah. Much the same way in Africa, there were stories where Nancy was like living in a house with a wife and son and things like that, and in some of them he's this trickster spider god living in the jungle messing with people. They're all in Nancy the same way these are all Coyote. There's a famous story about how Coyote put the stars in the sky.
Okay.
So one time Coyote was in the woods with his friends who were wolves. So there were 4 wolves and Coyote. And he noticed the wolves are constantly looking up at the sky whenever they howled. And so he kept looking up and saying, well, what's up there? And they said, well, they're not sure, but they're pretty sure there are animals up in the sky, but they have no way to get there to find out. So they're very curious, but they're looking up at the sky all the time and howling at them. They can't get a response. And so Coyote says, well, we'll see about that. So he scrounges around and he grabs like a bow and arrow, probably steals them from a nearby village. He comes back, and with his magic, he shoots the arrows into the sky, and it sticks there. And then shoots another arrow right behind it and sticks that. And he goes all the way down, shooting arrow after arrow until they line up, making a ladder right up into the heavens. Now at this time, the heavens are completely black. There's like nothing up there. So the wolves and Coyote climb up there. When they get there, they see it's a couple of grizzly bears, one bigger and one smaller, probably a mother bear and a baby. And so immediately, like the wolves are saying, well, don't approach them. Bears are incredibly dangerous. But these bears seemed oddly chill. So one by one, the wolves would approach the bears and start talking to them. And it turns out that they were very calm and peaceful. They were sky bears. And so Coyote stepped back and he looked at these 4 wolves and the 2 bears sitting there and says, that's a really great picture. I should preserve that for all time. And so he climbed down the ladder and pulled the arrows after him. And the wolves and the 2 bears wound up becoming stars. And to this day, you can see them in the sky. It's a constellation that we call the Big Dipper. The wolves, as they're approaching the bears, make up the handle. And then the handle is made up of the bears' bodies. Now, by an interesting coincidence, that constellation is also known as Ursa Major, the Great Bear. And is known under that name going all the way back to, ancient Greece.
That was what I was familiar with, so it threw me
Yep.
off for a minute.
Yeah, it's interesting that 2 groups of people, an entire world away and thousands of years apart, would both look at the same smattering of stars and saying, that looks like a bear to me.
That is
But
very interesting.
one thing I've repeated again and again is how the same ideas pop into people's heads all over the world because people are all the same. The Big Dipper is a very important constellation to virtually every culture because it points to Polaris, the North Star. African Americans, when they fled slavery, were told to follow the ladle, which is what they called the Big Dipper, like a ladle from a big, barrel of water, to follow the North Star to go north. And since almost everybody has to navigate by the stars, then that was the most important constellation. So every group has a myth about the Big Dipper. And so Coyote liked the looks of that so much that he spread more stars across the sky. So making a whole bunch of them. And so whenever anybody asked, he would say, tell them Coyote did that. Because he wanted people to look up at the sky forever. And every time they look up at the sky, they'll think about how Coyote put the stars in the sky.
So one more time, he put the stars in the sky via the arrows, yes?
Yeah. He climbed up with the arrows to put the wolves and the bears up there. Or the bears were already up there. He put the wolves up there with the arrows. But then once they were done, he threw other stars in the sky to give them a background, the perfect setting for them, It has to look just right.
So he's also an artist.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. But he wanted people to talk about him, forever. Every time they looked up at the sky, they'd think about Coyote, which he considers to be a terrific victory, needless to say.
We are.
And here we are talking about Coyote. You see? He did it again. Yeah, Coyote. What are you going to do? There's a great story, which I always like, about how Coyote brought fire to people.
Oh.
Because originally people had no fire. They had to eat everything cold and raw, and which is fine for Coyote, but human beings are having trouble with that. But not everyone was without fire. And there was one group that had mastered how to make fire, and they were known as, the fire people, needless to say. So Coyote gets together a bunch of his animal friends, and why animals follow him around, I don't know. They never learn their lesson. So he's hanging with like fox, wolf, and antelope. Why antelope is with this crew, I don't know. I imagine he's like, it's okay, it's cool, man, just don't notice me. So Coyote, fox, wolf, and antelope decide to go in search of the fire people to learn their secrets. And so they get there, and Coyote introduces himself as a famous god, and the fire people welcome him. And so they have a big feast, and they start naturally a fire. And so during the feast, they're eating, they're drinking, they're dancing around the fire, as they do. And so Coyote says, come on, this is a party. Now, actually, before the party begins, Coyote slips out, and he makes himself a headdress of pine needles. So this looks good for the party. So he's enjoying himself. He says, come on, build up the fire. This is a real party here. So he keeps encouraging them to build the fire like higher and higher. And it gets so hot that wolf, fox, and antelope have to leave. They're sweating. They go and get some fresh air outside where it's cooler. And Coyote keeps encouraging them to drink more and eat more and rouse up the fire. And Coyote dances. His dancing gets like wilder and wilder. And he finally dips his head into the flames, and the pine needles catch fire. And Coyote immediately screams and runs out of the lodge, runs outside, takes off his burning headdress, tosses it onto Antelope's horns, and says, "Run!" And so all the animals start running away. The fire people were, of course, very angry at losing their most powerful magic, and so they chase after them. And as they shoot the arrows, they manage to hit Antelope and bring him down. But Antelope, before he falls, passes off fire onto Fox. And so Fox carries a fire for a while, and he's running, and he's running, and he's running, and the people are catching up with him, and then Fox gets killed too, and he gives it to Wolf. So Wolf carries it for a while. And then finally, the last one is Coyote, who grabs it and carries it in his mouth, because at that time a lot of it is burned up. Which is why coyotes have a black mouth to this day. He runs up to the forest where the woods are really thick, and he hurls it up into the trees to hide it. And he erases all evidence that he was there. So the fire people come along, and they demand to know what happened to their fire, and he pretends he doesn't know. So to find out, they summon this powerful wind. And the wind knocks Coyote about, but it also hits the fire that's still kindling up there in the trees. So it catches the trees on fire, and suddenly there's this huge ravaging forest fire that goes across the land. So, although hundreds are killed in the conflagration, Coyote gets away with it, and once that's happened, everybody sees fire and figures out how it works. By then, all the tribes have fire, and the fire people have lost their advantage.
So, it reminds me of the many fires that we've seen on that side of the country.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, so sometimes fires they happen annually?
Yes. Fires are actually an important part of the ecosystem of a forest.
Yep.
Because you have to clear out the brush every so often to help the bigger trees grow.
So I wonder if that has something to do with the origin of the myth.
It's possible. Historically, before people came along, fires are mostly made by lightning.
Okay.
A lightning strike makes a fire, gets out of control very quickly. However, after it burns, it doesn't destroy the entire forest, and what's left will regrow and become even stronger.
Like in a volcanic ground.
Exactly, like in volcanic earth. They had severe fires in Yellowstone a while back. And some of them they let burn, much to the consternation of other people who weren't conservationists.
Yeah.
And they said after the fire went away, the rangers who lived in Yellowstone said they saw animals they thought were extinct in the area came back.
Yeah.
Because there was room for them now because they thinned out the forest.
Absolutely.
So a forest needs burning every now and then, It was probably just a coincidence that Coyote actually helped someone though. Because you're doing it for totally selfish reasons. Now, Coyote, there are so many stories about Coyote, and some of them he is really violent, and some of them he's very sexually aggressive. I'm not going to go into those stories. But a lot of them are full of slapstick humor. A lot of them, he's the butt of his own jokes. There's one in which Coyote's wandering along and he finds this tunnel going into the ground. And underneath, he finds this lodge that's full of all kinds of really cool stuff. So he noses around and thinks, well, I'll just grab this comb. They'll never miss that. And so he takes the comb and he's trotting it back to the surface. When the comb suddenly starts stabbing him, it's sticking him over and over again. So he's like, all right. So he brings back and he leaves the comb. All right, You're fine, Coma. I'm leaving you alone. They said, but that awl looks awfully nice. I can poke a lot of good holes with that awl. So he grabs the awl, starts taking back up to the surface, and once you know the awl comes to life, you want to start stabbing him. So he runs back, leaves the awl, all right, fine, fine. But I'm sure no one will miss that hammer. So he grabs the hammer, starts taking it to the surface, and the hammer flies out of his mouth, bops him on the head, and knocks him unconscious. He wakes up, looks around, and everything is back exactly where it was before, completely untouched. So Coyote says, all right, I know when I beat, I'm leaving you. But from now on, trolls will not be intelligent. From now on, they'll only do what humans want them to do until the end of time. So yes, they beat him, but he got his revenge on them, because to this day, people still use tools. Now, they mostly do what you want. But you never know. One of the cool stories, Coyote is visiting his friend, the kingfisher, who's a bird. And it's the middle of winter, and they're hanging out, chilling, you know, bros. And Coyote says he's hungry. Kingfisher says, no problem. So Kingfisher goes out, and he cuts his branch, sharpens it a little bit, and he flies up in the air, and he flies over a frozen lake that has a hole in it. And he shoots down into the water, and comes back up with a fish speared on his piece of wood. So he comes back up, and Kingfisher and Coyote enjoy the meal, so it's a good time. So later on that same winter, Kingfisher comes to visit Coyote. And Kingfisher is feeling a little peckish. So Coyote says, I know what to do. So Coyote thinks to himself, you know, I can hunt on my own, but the way that Kingfisher did it looked so easy. I'm going to use that method myself. So he went out and he cut a branch and sharpened it really sharp. And then he also took more pieces of wood and he carved a bill just like Kingfisher has. And he climbed to the tallest tree he could find that leaned out over the hole in the lake, and he dove off, and he missed the hole completely and smashed into the ice.
So he impaled himself.
Yeah. So it turns out imitating people is often not the best way of doing something. That reminds me of the time that Coyote really wanted a roadrunner, a nice juicy roadrunner. So he painted this like tunnel on the side of a mountain, and Roadrunner came running along, and he raced right through the tunnel. And Coyote chased after him, and then smashed into the rock and fell down with a broken nose and stars floating over his head.
I remember that.
Yeah, you probably remember that story. It's not an actual Native American myth, but Chuck Jones, when he created Coyote and Roadrunner, was totally influenced by a lot of these Native American stories.
Really?
There's several of them. I'm not sure how much research he actually did, but several of the Coyote stories are just slapstick comedy. Stingray falls and smashes him or drops something on himself. It happens a lot.
Okay.
So like I said, there are a million Coyote stories. I also want to talk about Raven a little bit. I tried to find the Raven stories that are like different. Do you ever wonder why ravens have black feathers?
Why?
I'm sure it's bothered you. There's a couple of different stories, actually, contradictory stories. So one of the stories is that a water bird, the petrel, had gathered all the water of the world and had it in one place, so no one could drink any water. And they were very sad, of course, and very thirsty. So Raven visited him and thought that was really unfair. So that night, while Petrel was sleeping, Raven snuck out and grabbed some animal dung and spread it like all over Petrel. So Petrel woke up the next morning, he's like, ooh, my wings are covered in this crap. So he goes outside and tries to like rub off all the dung in the dirt. And so while he's gone, Raven goes where the water is stored and swallows up all the water. And he flies away with it. So Petrel sees what's going on and he summons like wind spears to try to stop Raven. And Raven is like flapping and flapping and flapping. His feathers are white at this point. I should have started that way. I should have started with that line.
Oh.
That's actually the beginning of it. So while he's trapped by the air spirits, Petrel sets a fire. And the black smoke from the fire stains Raven's wings. But he's able to pull away. However, during the fight against the air spirits, the water starts spilling from his mouth. And it spills and it splashes down in all kinds of weird like shapes and spills out, and a big mouthful of it comes down and creates rivers, and another one that creates lakes and so forth. But he escapes and he brings all the water back to the earth, so people have water again. The story of someone who's flying who spits out water appears in several different cultures also. But this is one of the coolest ones.
It's like a pterodactyl-sized raven.
It was a huge raven.
Larger.
It was a huge raven.
It would have to be.
Yeah. Yeah, Odin does something similar in a story we'll get to in Norse mythology. So,
Really?
yeah, it's a popular theme. But if you don't like that one, there's another story about how Raven got black feathers. In this version of the story, Raven starts out with really bright colored feathers. And so at that time, there was no sun. So Raven sets out to find the sun. And he finally locates it up in the sky, a group of people living up in the clouds who are called the Sun People. And he guesses that they've got the sun hidden away because of, the name. And as he's thinking about things, a beautiful young woman comes out. And she's drawing water from a spring. And so he changes himself into a pine needle, floats down, lands, gets into the cup of water that she's made, and she swallows him. And wouldn't you know it, after that, she gets pregnant.
Okay.
That's apparently how it works. So she gives birth to a child who's oddly intelligent, for a baby, and has shiny black hair and really bright, inquisitive eyes. And so as the child grows, it gets a little more mobile. He starts exploring the whole village. And he eventually goes into one of the big medicine lodges. And in there he sees this very large, woven, wooden box that has bright light oozing out from between the cracks. He thinks, aha. So he points at the box and goes, caw, caw. And he goes, what did you say? He said, I mean, goo, goo. And so they're a little bit suspicious of this. But his mother takes him back and puts him in the cradle for the night. And so that night, when everybody's fallen asleep, he escapes. And he throws it open, and sure enough, the sun is inside. So he changes back into raven form, grabs the sun, and flies away with it. However, being so close to the sun, it naturally burns all the color off of his feathers. And so he winds up black after that.
I see.
There's also an identical story where Coyote does the exact same thing, except he carries the sun in his mouth down to the earth. And that's the version in that story why his mouth is black.
It's funny. I'm just I don't know, the idea that there needs to be an explanation for why his feathers are whatever color they may be, or the mouth, or what have you. It's just interesting.
Yeah, everything's shown through the focus of a storytelling lens. There has to be a story behind it. I've also had requests to talk about Kachinas.
Which are?
Kachinas they're from the Southwest as well. They're famous amongst the Hopi and several of the Pueblo tribes, the Hopi, the Zuni, and people like that. Kachinas are very popular. They're most famous because of the Kachina dolls. They're these carved wooden figures.
Yes.
You've probably seen them. They're really beautiful. The original antique ones are worth a fortune. They're still being produced to this day by native craftsmen, but they're frequently sold to tourists. But they represent a powerful spiritual tradition. The Kachina, the word can mean three things. It can mean the actual godlike spirits. It can refer to the Kachina dance, where people become the spirits by donning outfits like them, or the actual dolls. And in their stories, the dolls and the spirits are the same thing. Each Kachina represents something. It can be corn or beans or the stars. Theoretically, everything in the universe has a Kachina, and they all exist on equal level. There are huge lists of them and their names and so forth like that. And each of the Kachinas are unique because they're carved by craftsmen who use their own instincts when they carve them. So you can have two different Kachinas that each represent corn, but they look different. And this allows them to create ones that don't have a sacred value to be sold to tourists. They look like Kachinas, and they are Kachinas, but to the Hopi, the things they would look for that would indicate, oh, that's a magical thing, isn't there.
What?
I'm not sure. No one. I haven't found anyone who actually says, online at least, exactly what that is.
Also,
but
do these dolls, the actual magical ones, are they believed to come to life in any way?
Yes, because in one of the stories, there's two different contradictory stories. In one of them, the original Kachinas were magical people. They were people like the Hopi who had come to this world from another world. The Hopi have a myth that there's several different universes side by side, and the Hopi traveled here from one world. As they arrived with the Kachinas with them, who at that time were more like people, but they had tremendous magic powers. and they helped the Hopi to thrive and flourish in this new land. Since they were trying to carve out a civilization from a lot of desert, so, you know. However, they were attacked by their enemies, and the Kachinas laid down their lives.
Who were their enemies?
Another tribe, they don't really say.
Oh, not the Kachinas.
No, the Kachinas were killed, and the Hopi were left behind without them. But the Kachinas exist now only as spirits. But the spirits went back to the world where they originally came from. So they're still a part of this world, but they're not physically here anymore, which is why you have to carve a doll that they will manifest into. They also have the Kachina dance, in which ceremonial dancers don robes that are dressed to look like Kachina figures. There's a lot of powerful reoccurring Kachina figures. You can go online and find depictions of them and so forth. There's lots of footage of the Kachina dances that are still being done. But the Kachina dolls are the most famous. And traditionally, this was carved by an uncle for his niece. And he would give it to the young girl, like around 11 or 12. And he would tell her what the Kachina is and what it represents, and she would treat it like it was a living person, with like furniture to sit on and a bed to sleep in and so forth, sometimes even food and so forth, things like that. You had to treat it with respect, as it was a powerful figure.
It's a lot of responsibility for an 11-year-old.
It happens by an odd coincidence at the same time that women start to physically mature and stop being children and become adults. This is an adult responsibility, taking care of a Kachina. It's a lifelong responsibility.
Wow.
So it's part of that ceremony. It's not specifically an adulthood ceremony, but it obviously has strong similarities to do that.
Coming of age.
Yeah, it's definitely a coming of age thing. Yeah, again, Kachinas are like all over online, but mostly what I found was advice for collectors on which ones to buy, and things like that. Because there's a huge market for it.
Is there a particular holiday that they're associated with?
I'm not sure. I'm sure there is for the Hopi.
I actually came across them as I was doing a study on holidays a year ago. I just can't recall what holiday it might be. Interesting though.
Yeah, it's still very important to their people. All right, so that is something from the Southwest. A little bit of the Northwest. What do you think?
I love it. Just perspectives that are, you know, we see differences, but then despite these massive geographical miles apart, you still see so many similarities.
Yeah.
And it's just very interesting and telling about people.
Yeah.
So I'm loving it.
Yeah, it's interesting, the Native American worldview, that people and animals are more or less the same thing. You know, Coyote can interact with people on a normal day-to-day basis, but also be a god and be an animal. Some of the Coyote stories involve him trying to scrounge food through various sources and usually failing. There's several scatological stories. There's one in which Coyote gets into a contest as to who can shoot the longest stream of excrement, which he wins, of course.
Is that where that began?
I don't know. There's a story. The story is there's a dead buffalo that's being eaten by a bunch of ravens, and the Coyote wants his share of it, and they say no. And he says, "How about a contest?" And so they decide they'll have a scatological contest as to who can shoot their poo the furthest. And so Coyote runs out and eats rose hips, which notoriously cause gas. And so he's able to completely excel the ravens with his performance. And he got all the dead buffalo to himself.
You could also go to McDonald's.
He could have just gone to McDonald's. Yeah, well, that's the easy way of doing things. Tricksters never do things the easy way. It always has to be complicated and tricksy. I think that's about it for today.
Well, where are we headed?
I'm going to stick with Native Americans next time. I'll figure out exactly what I can come up with for next time. And I'll tell you before then.
All right.
Until next time, I have been Ed.
Solitaire.
We'll see you again, and be safe.